For our January concert, the Philharmonic and I are preparing a fun mixed grill. We have the classicism of Mozart, the early romanticism of Schubert, the late Russian romanticism of Anatol Liadov, and finally a symphony by the greatest composer ever to come out of Denmark, Carl Nielsen. Schubert's music for the play Rosamunde was a product of his 26th year, which is to say 5 years before his ridiculously untimely death. And it's a favorite in the concert hall. It has many of his thumbprints in it. Somebody once observed that one of the ways you can always pick Schubert out is that even in what could be an otherwise unblemished happy moment, he always has to put in that one little note of pain. And as I've been studying the overture, I found several instances where he could have written it one way, but opted for another way. There's one little fanfare-like passage, which he might have written like this. Or a little more blandly, he could have written like this. But listen now to the chord that precedes the final resolution to C major. There's that little stinging, painful note that makes it not quite the unadulteratedly happy fanfare it might have been. You hear that chord, which is certainly more painful than the other two versions, or Schubert always had to remind you that his life was a tragic one. Mozart wrote 27 piano concertos. Of those 27, only 2 are in a minor key, the 20th in D minor and the 24th, which we're performing with the superb local pianist Alan Dameron, is in C minor. And of those 2, the C minor is the only one that stays in C minor to the very end. There are a few Mozart pieces where he does not defect to the major, as was common when you would write a piece in a minor key in those days, but he absolutely keeps his fist clenched to the bitter end and ends in a very defiant C minor. This is for people who think that Mozart is all dainty pinkies up all the time. He certainly is not. The piece opens up with a series of strange, meandering, questioning gestures in the strings, and it seems like he no sooner tries to extricate himself from one corner when he gets trapped in another one. The piece opens up and from that he gets himself into another corner, and then even more strangely, and finally into C minor. But you put them all together and it seems like this lost soul trying desperately to at least establish a key in which to be. Etc. So very strange, not particularly happy beginning to this very, very defiant, almost morbid piece of music, albeit possessed of a very beautiful slow movement. We know that Beethoven frequently paid homage to Mozart, and in the only Beethoven piano concerto in a minor key, the third one, it is said that he had this opening very much in mind. So from Mozart, Beethoven came up with his own series of 2 statements in C minor, also beginning very softly. So very conscious tipping of the hat to Mozart, and it's also recorded that Beethoven, a very fine concert pianist, would frequently play the Mozart 24th Concerto in concert. It was one of his specialty pieces. Carl Nielsen, Denmark's greatest composer, is one of those 20th century composers who's been knocking on the door of the basic repertoire for a long, long time, and he hasn't quite made his way in there. There are several other composers like him. I'm thinking of Arthur Honegger, of Frank Martin, of Bohuslav Martinu. where when audiences hear them, they tend to like them, and yet there's something just a little bit different, a little bit quirky about the music that I think has kept them from becoming mainstays the way Prokofiev and Vaughan Williams and Aaron Copland have. And it's a shame because Nielsen's music is very, very personal. The music of somebody who understood life, who understood its ups and its downs. The Sixth Symphony, the one that we're performing, is an example, I think, of Nielsen's supreme irony. Even the title, Sinfonia Semplice, is total red herring. It is not a simple symphony by any means, neither to penetrate emotionally nor to play. It goes through an incredible series of peaks and valleys emotionally. In some ways, the piece, even though it does call for some massed use of the orchestra, it's almost a series of little chamber pieces. The second movement, for example, in the midst of the symphony for a grand orchestra, only calls on 9 players, 3 of whom are the percussionists. Very strange, acerbic movement where all the trombone does for the entirety of the movement is somebody said it sounds like a music critic getting bored every time the music gets to be too tonal. The piece opens up in the highest possible reaches of the orchestra with 4 pings on the glockenspiel. And about 35 or 40 minutes later, the last sound you hear is the 2 bassoons blatting out their lowest possible note in unison. So he really makes a journey from here at the outset to there at the finale. And even the relationship of the first and last movements thematically is kind of a reversal. The very first theme that you hear after the pings on the glockenspiel in the opening is the violins. And it ends, as you heard, with an ascending major chord. And the theme upon which he bases the theme and variations finale ends with a descending major chord. So the whole symphony kind of does this about face and ends almost as an opposite to the way that it began. It is even said that at one really dramatic point in the first movement that Nielsen was trying to mirror in music the nearly fatal heart attack that he had. A very alarming moment in an otherwise sort of strangely bucolic 15 minutes of music. Nielsen had a pretty rough life. He was barely known in his native country, certainly not internationally known, and really fought not quite a hand-to-mouth existence, but it was not an easy life for him, even though he felt, not unhumbly, that he was doing the best that he could. Apparently, as the story goes, a major music dictionary or encyclopedia came out. It might even have been the then brand new edition of Grove's Dictionary. And there was about an 8-page article devoted to Sibelius and an 8-line paragraph devoted to Nielsen. And it just so happened that shortly after the publication of this book and this disparity in these 2 articles was well known and gossiped about, Sibelius and Nielsen happened to be brought together at this party to meet. And Sibelius was noticeably humble and uncomfortable. And apparently he finally, after hemming and hawing a bit, he looked at Nielsen and he said, "I have no idea why they make such a fuss over me. I don't come up to your shoe tops." I'm a big fan of the New Yorker's music columnist Alex Ross, who has pointed me and many other readers in some fascinating directions, both musical and literary. And I'm indebted to him for bringing to my attention a book called Living Music, which I believe is a series of essays that Nielsen wrote, which were translated and prepared by Reginald Spink. And I wanted to just read some of this essay that Nielsen wrote on the subject of originality in music, because certainly his own music exemplifies everything that he said, but it's opinionated and generous and very human all at the same time. I like very much what he had to say. It is right that the historian should indicate the summits of achievement in art, the poetry, architecture, and sculpture of ancient Greece, 16th and 18th century music, Renaissance painting, etc. But in a sense, this is of little use to us. The claims of life are stronger than the sublimest art. And even were we to agree that we had achieved the best and most beautiful it is possible to achieve, we would be impelled in the end, thirsting as we do more for life and experience than for perfection, to cry out, "Give us something else, give us something new, for heaven's sake give us something bad, so long as we feel we are alive and active and not just passive admirers of tradition." There may, therefore, be some sense in the thesis, said to be current in certain artistic and musical circles in Paris, which, if I've understood it all right, declares that it is not so much a question of turning out good art in the accepted sense as of creating a stir and putting life into things. I find it tempting to draw the logical conclusion and strive to achieve something bad. This may sound a paradox, but it is no use trying to apply generally accepted ethical standards to art. Perhaps its very nature is the reverse of the ethical. Do we not say that art is free? Now, if we were to strive intensely to achieve the opposite of what has previously been deemed good, we should at last come full circle and no harm would be done. So-called progress, it should be remembered, is in rings and circles. It is the color of the rings and not their shape or course, which varies with the times. This brings us to the very interesting question of originality. Movements like the one mentioned spring from an intense desire for something different, something fresh, original, and surprising. The creative artist will not tolerate continued neglect and indifference. This instinct for display lies so deep in our nature that it is a tremendous driving force to those made of the right stuff. But it is exacting, and the smaller and slenderer the talent, the more careful must it be to abstain from seeking great originality. Nothing in all art is as painful as unsuccessful originality. It is like the twisted grimaces of vanity. We see the spirit everywhere. Some of us know it, but have no word for it. We exchange looks and shudder like children at the sight of a skeleton. We see it in houses, paintings, statues, music, and most of all where artists have wanted to express strong emotion. Joy howls, Cupid squirms and writhes, mirth is stylized on stilts, and sorrow and grief look like the mask of some sphinx with great hollow eyes. This is what happens when a man of insufficient talent tries to be original and do things for which he has neither the feeling nor the powers. Oh, you artists! See how Albrecht Dürer paints a blade of grass, how Schubert composed a little song. Learn that the smallest shall be the greatest, that 2 colors, 3 notes, 2 right angles in a circle sufficed for the man who found delight as a humble servant of art.